What if the entire American economy collapsed? Banks failed across the country, people rioted in the streets, and the only thing standing between total financial destruction and survival was one 69-year-old banker deciding, personally, in his private library, which institutions lived and which died. October 1907, New York City. The Knickerbocker Trust Company collapses after a run by depositors. Within days, panic spreads to other trust companies and banks. Depositors line up by the thousands demanding their money, but banks don't have it because they practice fractional reserve banking and lent out most deposits. By October 22nd, 12 major financial institutions have failed. The New York Stock Exchange is on the verge of closing because there's no liquidity to settle trades, and the city of New York itself is about to default on bond payments. The federal government has no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no mechanism to inject liquidity or stop the panic. Treasury Secretary George Cordeleau rushes to New York with $25 million in government funds, but that's barely a fraction of what's needed. Estimates suggested $200 to $300 million were required to stabilize the system. The entire American financial system is hours from complete collapse. And John Pierpont Morgan, JPMorgan, calls a meeting in his private library at Madison Avenue and 36th Street. He locks the doors. He literally locks the bankers inside and tells them nobody leaves until they agree to pool resources to stop the panic. For the next 3 weeks, Morgan personally decides which banks get rescued, which fail, which survive, and at what terms. He is not elected. He holds no government position. He is accountable to nobody. But he controls American finance because he has more money and more power than the United States government. This is the story of how the 1907 crisis revealed that private banking power exceeded government power, why Morgan used the crisis to consolidate control over competitors and acquire assets at depression prices, how saving the system and owning the system were the same thing, and why the Federal Reserve was created specifically to prevent one man from having Morgan's power, but instead institutionalized that power permanently. The pattern is clear. Financial crises concentrate wealth and power. The people who rescue the system extract maximum benefit, and institutions created to prevent this become the mechanism for doing it at even larger scale. Let's start with what actually caused the 1907 panic and why it revealed systemic fragility. The immediate trigger was Augustus Hines and Charles Morse, two financiers who tried to corner the stock of United Copper Company in October 1907. They bought up shares, hoping to squeeze short sellers who'd have to buy from them at inflated prices. The scheme failed spectacularly when they couldn't maintain the corner. Copper shares crashed, Hines and Morse were bankrupted, and this exposed that they controlled several banks that had lent money for the copper speculation. One of those banks was Knickerbocker Trust, the third largest trust company in New York with $60 million in deposits. When depositors learned Knickerbocker's president Charles Barney was connected to the failed copper scheme, they panicked and demanded their money. October 21st, Knickerbocker faced a bank run. By noon October 22nd, Knickerbocker had paid out $8 million to depositors, exhausted reserves, and closed its doors. The failure triggered panic across New York because if Knickerbocker could fail, any institution could fail. Trust companies, which function like banks but with less regulation, faced runs by depositors. Smaller banks faced runs. The panic spread to the stock market where investors tried to sell everything, but there were no buyers and liquidity dried up completely. The New York Stock Exchange was on the verge of closing October 24th because brokerage houses couldn't settle trades without short-term loans, and no bank would lend because they needed all available cash to pay depositors. This is when Morgan intervened. Here's what Morgan actually did during the crisis and why his power was absolute. October 22nd, when Knickerbocker failed, Morgan met with leading bankers at his library and organized a pool of liquidity to support solvent institutions. Note the word, solvent. Morgan decided which institutions deserved rescue based on his personal assessment of their books. Knickerbocker was allowed to fail because Morgan determined it was mismanaged and saving it would waste resources. The Trust Company of America, which was also facing a run, received $25 million in emergency support because Morgan decided it was fundamentally sound and worth saving. Who made this determination? Morgan. By what authority? his own money, and the respect other bankers had for his judgment. October 23rd, Morgan called a meeting of trust company presidents at his library at 8 p.m. He reviewed the books of Trust Company of America personally, examining balance sheets and assets until after midnight, then declared at 2 a.m. that the institution was solvent and would be saved. His word was law. No government regulator reviewed the decision. No democratic process approved it. No oversight existed. Morgan said save it, so it was saved. October 24th, the stock exchange was about to close because brokerage houses needed $25 million in loans to settle trades. Morgan called bankers to his library at 2 p.m., locked the doors, and told them nobody left until they agreed to contribute to a $25 million pool. By 2:16 p.m., 16 minutes, the bankers had agreed because Morgan gave them no choice. The alternative was market collapse that would destroy them all. The stock exchange stayed open. October 26th, the city of New York needed $30 million to avoid defaulting on bond payments due November 1st. Morgan organized a syndicate of banks to purchase city bonds, saving New York from bankruptcy. Throughout this period, Morgan worked 18 to 20-hour days, held meetings in his library, made decisions about which institutions lived or died, and coordinated response to the crisis with Treasury Secretary Cortelyou. But Morgan wasn't subordinate to Cortelyou. Cortelyou brought $25 million in government funds and asked Morgan how to deploy them. The government was Morgan's assistant, not his supervisor. Now here's the part that reveals this was wealth extraction disguised as salvation. Morgan acquired enormous assets during the crisis at depression prices. The most significant was Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. TC&I was a steel company that controlled valuable mineral rights in Alabama and was a potential competitor to Morgan's US Steel Corporation. During the panic, the brokerage firm Moore and Schley held large amounts of TC&I stock as collateral for loans. If Moore and Schley failed, it could trigger another wave of panic because they were a major firm. November 2nd, Morgan decided the solution was for US Steel to purchase TC&I from Moore and Schley at $45 per share, a price that valued TC&I far below its actual worth. Independent assessments suggested TC&I was worth at least $90 to $100 per share based on its mineral holdings, meaning Morgan acquired it at 50 to 60% discount. There was one problem. This would give US Steel even greater monopoly power, potentially violating antitrust laws. So Morgan sent his partners Elbert Gary and Henry Clay Frick to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt at 6 a.m. on November 4th to get approval. Roosevelt, desperate to prevent further panic, gave verbal assurance the administration wouldn't challenge the acquisition. US Steel bought TC&I, eliminated a competitor, acquired valuable assets at depression prices, and strengthened Morgan's steel monopoly, all justified as necessary to prevent Moore and Schley's failure from triggering more panic. Morgan saved the system and made himself wealthier simultaneously. This is the pattern that repeats in every financial crisis. The people with power to rescue the system extract maximum value for themselves while rescuing it. The crisis cost the American economy billions in lost output. Thousands lost their jobs, depositors lost savings, but Morgan emerged richer and more powerful than before. The power dynamic revealed by 1907 was so extreme it led directly to the Federal Reserve's creation, but not in the way you'd think. After the crisis, there was widespread recognition that the United States couldn't have its financial stability dependent on one 70-year-old man who might die at any moment. Morgan was 69 in 1907, and there was no succession plan for his role as de facto central banker. Congress held hearings. The Pujo Committee investigated the money trust, Morgan, and a handful of other bankers who controlled American finance. The hearings revealed that Morgan, through interlocking directorates and partnerships, controlled banks, trust companies, insurance companies, and corporations representing combined resources of $22 billion, roughly 30% of American wealth at the time. One man and his partners controlled a third of the economy. The public was outraged. But here's the critical point. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 wasn't designed to break this power. It was designed to institutionalize it. The Fed was created ostensibly to provide elastic currency and prevent panics like 1907, but it was structured to serve banking interests. Regional Federal Reserve banks were owned by member banks, private institutions. The Federal Reserve Board in Washington was government-appointed, but the Open Market Committee that controlled monetary policy was dominated by regional Fed presidents chosen by banks. The Fed wasn't a government institution controlling banks. It was banks controlling a government-sanctioned institution that gave them collective power Morgan had wielded individually. Instead of one man deciding which banks lived or died, now a committee of bankers made those decisions, but the fundamental power structure remained. Private banking interests controlling money supply, credit, and financial rescue. The 1907 crisis proved that private banking power exceeded government power. The solution wasn't to transfer power to democratic institutions. It was to formalize private banking power through a pseudo-governmental institution that appeared public, but served private interests. The pattern from 1907 to 2008 is direct and clear. In 1907, private bankers led by Morgan decided which institutions were too important to fail, provided liquidity on their own terms, and extracted value while rescuing the system. In 2008, the Federal Reserve and Treasury made the same decisions. Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail, AIG was rescued, Bear Stearns was sold to JPMorgan Chase at depression prices, Bank of America acquired Merrill Lynch. The difference was institutional. Instead of one man in a library, it was Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson in Washington, but the mechanism was identical. Private banking interests with government backing decided which institutions lived and died, provided trillions in liquidity, and major banks consolidated power by acquiring failed competitors at distressed prices. J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan's direct descendant, acquired Bear Stearns for $2 per share in March 2008, a company that traded at $170 per share 1 year earlier, then acquired Washington Mutual's banking operations for $1.9 billion in September 2008, getting assets worth hundreds of billions for pennies on the dollar. Bank of America acquired Merrill Lynch. Wells Fargo acquired Wachovia. The 2008 crisis concentrated banking power exactly like 1907 did, except at much larger scale, because the Fed institutionalized the mechanism Morgan pioneered. And just like 1907, the people who saved the system were the same people who benefited most from the crisis. The big banks that survived became even bigger and more powerful than before because smaller competitors were eliminated and their assets absorbed at depression prices. This is the empire pattern that explains how financial capitalism actually works. Crises concentrate wealth and power. The people with power to rescue the system extract maximum value while rescuing it, and institutions created to prevent private control become mechanisms for institutionalizing private control. In 1907, Morgan had more power than the US government because he had more money and government had no central bank. Morgan used the crisis to eliminate competitors, acquire assets cheap, and strengthen his monopoly while being celebrated for saving America. The Federal Reserve was created specifically to prevent one man from having that much power, but it gave that power to banking interests collectively and made it permanent. In 2008, the Fed and Treasury had power to rescue the system, used it to bail out major banks while letting smaller institutions fail, and major banks emerged larger and more powerful than before the crisis. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup now control roughly 45% of all banking assets in America. 4 institutions control almost half the financial system. Morgan would be proud. He spent a lifetime building monopoly power, and his descendant institution J.P. Morgan Chase now has more power than Morgan ever did, and it's backed by government rescue mechanisms he could only dream about. The man who saved America in 1907 by locking bankers in his library and forcing them to pool resources also owned America by acquiring competitors at depression prices while being celebrated as a hero. That's not a contradiction, that's how the system works. This is the empire economy, where we decode systems operating in plain sight but rarely explained honestly. J.P. Morgan didn't save America in 1907 out of patriotism or civic duty. He saved it because financial collapse would destroy his wealth too, and by controlling the rescue, he extracted maximum benefit while preventing collapse. He decided which institutions lived, which died, and acquired competitors at depression prices while being celebrated as a hero. The Federal Reserve was created to prevent this, but instead institutionalized the mechanism so banking interests collectively have the power Morgan had individually, backed by government that treats too big to fail as permanent policy. Financial crises don't happen to the banking system. They're features of how the system works, concentrating wealth and power to those who control credit during moments when everyone else is desperate. Morgan understood this perfectly in 1907. Jamie Dimon understands it perfectly in 2025. The man who controls liquidity during crisis controls everything, and calling it rescue doesn't change that it's extraction.